The first of our celebration sessions for Women History Month and International Women's Day. For those of you who don't know, the University of California Women in Technology Committee is a self-chartered, independent entity that promotes a supportive, inclusive environment to advance the professional goals and aspirations of UC Women in Technology. UC WIT is composed of volunteers from all UC locations, representing various departments and positions within the technology function. Before we get started, we do want to thank our planning committee, Carolina Manel, who's chair and is a rep from UC Irvine, Janae Blunt, who is a steering committee member from UC Berkeley, Rita Rosenthal, also a committee member from UC Berkeley, and Elisa Tecklenburg, committee member representative from UC San Francisco. We also want to take this time to do a land acknowledgement. UC WIT recognizes that our service occurs on the unceded territory of the Indigenous people of California, and that these lands were and continue to be of great importance to them. Every member of our community has and continues to benefit from the use and stewardship of these lands. With respect and gratitude, we acknowledge and we make visible our relationship to the original caretakers. As I mentioned earlier, we have a couple of sessions that are a part of this celebration. Please join us on Thursday at noon for Laura Klein of Emory University, who will be talking about data feminism. And now I will introduce our speaker, Brandie Nonnecke. Brandie is the founding director of the CITRIS Policy Lab, headquartered at UC Berkeley. She is an associate research professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy, where she directs the Tech Policy Initiative. The Tech Policy Initiative is a collaborative between CITRIS and GSPP to strengthen tech policy education, research, and impact. Brandie is also the host of Tech Hype, a groundbreaking video and podcast series that cuts through the hype around emerging technologies to get to what matters. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Brandie Nonnecke.
Great. Thank you so much for having me today. And it's exciting to see how many people have tuned in. I see that number just going up and up and up. So as was mentioned, I am Brandie Nonnecke, and I'm here today to cut through the hype around artificial intelligence. I don't think that there's probably any technology more hyped currently than AI. So at the end of my presentation today, I hope that you'll walk away being able to kind of cut through some of the myths and misunderstandings of these marvels of machine learning. And with that, let me share my presentation. Great. Now, today's presentation, Beyond the Hype, Unraveling the Myths, Realities, and Governance of AI. And as was mentioned, I'm the director of the CITRIS Policy Lab, also have an appointment at the Goldman School of Public Policy, and I am the director of a part of the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology, where I head up their AI Platforms and Society project. And I'm also the host of Tech Hype, which I'll talk about more in a minute. But first, when we're thinking about artificial intelligence, we often think of this sort of oracle, this almost sentient thing that can solve all of our challenges, all of our problems. You need that perfect email crafted, turn to ChatGPT. You need to create a stunning image to include in your presentation, check out Midjourney. And while it may seem like this miracle product, there's actually a really simple explanation for how this technology works. And second, that there's all sorts of types of machine learning. Now, while we're hyper-focused right now on essentially generative AI like ChatGPT, there are other forms of machine learning that are in use currently and have been in use for decades, even across the University of California campus, that is making decisions that affect the way that our faculty, staff, and students engage with and flourish at the University of California. One of my missions is to cut through the hype around emerging technologies to better ensure that we can have the discussion that we need to have, rather than focusing purely on this utopian narrative of generative AI being able to solve climate change issues, for example, or a dystopian narrative of robots replacing workers and the death of creativity and original thought. Instead, the discussion has to be much more nuanced. And so on Tech Hype, I sit down with experts to debunk misunderstandings around emerging technologies, debate the real benefits and risks, and then talk about what are the technical and policy interventions we can implement to better ensure we can harness the technology for good. So I would love it if you would all check out our series. In addition to those episodes, we also offer Tech Hype TLDRs, Too Long Didn't Read, where I analyze and summarize emerging tech policies, several of which will have an effect on how the University of California itself procures and uses advanced technologies. So I hope that you will check them out. So first, we have to just do some level setting. When we're talking about AI, artificial intelligence, it's really important that we are not talking past each other. I've been in several meetings where it becomes clear about 20 minutes in or 15 minutes in that when I'm talking about AI, somebody else might be interpreting it as only focusing on generative AI tools like ChatGPT. But there's a continuum of different types of artificial intelligence. And I actually prefer to refer to it as machine learning rather than artificial intelligence. And I'll talk a little bit more about why as I go through. First, AI is not new. It's been around since the 1950s. Its basis is in algorithms and statistics. If any of you remember back to some of your statistics courses of linear and logistical regression, a lot of the machine learning is based off of that. And a lot of the machine learning that we use today to make decisions in high consequential areas. So essentially, we have all sorts of machine learning algorithms that are being used that are essentially surreptitiously making decisions that affect our lives every day. You've engaged with several machine learning algorithms today. If any of you hopped onto YouTube this morning or you hopped onto Netflix or anywhere else and it fed you up a recommendation, well, guess what? That's machine learning. It's a recommender system. And there has been research that shows, for example, look at Google search engine. Google search engine can reinforce biases. Professor Sophia Noble at UCLA wrote the book Algorithms of Oppression, where she looked at how Google search can reinforce biases in society. So it's not inconsequential, even these simple forms of machine learning. At the CITRIS Policy Lab, we maintain a database of all federal and California-related AI legislation. Now, a lot of these bills are always the bridesmaid, never the bride. They don't actually ever really make it into passing into law. There's about almost 300 bills that are captured in this database and about a handful that have moved forward. But in that database, you can look and see, was it bipartisan? Was it introduced by a Republican, introduced by a Democrat? What area is it trying to focus on? You can also export the data. It's in Airtable. You can export it as a CSV and play with it if you were so interested. Now, when we're talking about how we define AI, I like to think about the ways that we define it in two ways. First, how we define it by laws and institutions is really important. And I'm sure many of you are facing this challenge right now on your campus, where you're hearing these new policies being developed, where we need to be concerned about the use of AI in X, Y, and Z category, and we should be putting in place a policy. Well, when we're talking about AI, what are we saying? Now, there's been some leadership in this at the federal level. The National AI Initiative Act, which is essentially our most comprehensive piece of AI legislation at the federal level, that established the National AI Initiative Act and gives us our first sort of solid definition of what the federal government was thinking about when they're talking about AI. So you can see here, though, that they call it a machine-based system that can, for a given set of human-defined objectives. That's really important. That's human-defined objectives. And I'll explain more in a minute. Make predictions, recommendations, or decisions influencing real or virtual environments. Now, building on that definition, NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, early last year, they introduced the AI Risk Management Framework, which is our nation's voluntary risk assessment, meaning no company actually has to implement that risk assessment. It's completely voluntary, but it is a pretty good start. And one thing that we're starting to see, however, is that legislation proposed, especially at the state level, we can see them using the language that essentially would require a developer of an AI system, especially those in high-risk areas, to conduct a NIST AI RMF. Now, NIST defines an AI system as an engineered or machine-based system that can, for a given set of objectives, now there we see they dropped human defined. That's really important because the trajectory of machine learning has transitioned from very meticulous human-defined objectives to models that can identify new objectives by trial and error. And I'll give some examples of how this has worked and how this has gone awry. And this is all based off of the OECD recommendations, and there has been a growing consensus that that is a good definition to follow. Now, the big elephant in the room, or I guess around the globe, is the European Union. Now, the European Union passed the EU AI Act. This is the world's most comprehensive piece of AI-related legislation. And you might be thinking, why do we care what the European Union is doing? Well, we care because the large companies that are based in the United States, if they want to operate within the European Union, they have to be compliant with the EU AI Act. And it's really inefficient for them to apply different standards geo-blocked just to the European Union. Probably even today, when you went to a new web page, you probably had to click something that said, yes, I accept all cookies. That originally started because of the European Union and their general data protection regulation. It's more efficient for a website, a platform, to just roll that out across all users, regardless of where they are connecting to the website from. And I expect, and other experts in the field expect, that even US-based companies, if they want to sell their product in the European Union, they're very likely going to implement those standards across all users of their platform. So the EU, they define an AI system having some elements of autonomy that is based on machine and or human provided data and inputs. And like I was saying before, that's really important because that's how the field of machine learning is progressing more toward machine-defined objectives, maybe some objectives that are more efficient and effective than what a human would be able to identify. And of course, when we're talking about AI, we should talk about how it's actually defined technically by the field. So artificial intelligence is a subfield within computer science. And underneath artificial intelligence, a more specific type is machine learning. Now, machine learning is essentially the most ubiquitous type of AI in operation today. Like I was saying before, when you go to Google to look for something online, you go to YouTube, you go to Netflix, that recommender system, that algorithm is a form of machine learning. And there are essentially 3 buckets of machine learning. The first, let's just put them together, supervised versus unsupervised machine learning. And I'll give concrete examples of what I mean. Deep learning, and then reinforcement learning. So let's look at machine learning. I'm sure many of you have seen these terms on here, or you've heard them in conversation, right? Supervised machine learning, unsupervised machine learning, reinforcement learning, deep learning, generative AI, foundation models, general purpose AI. It's about to take your breath away. It's too many different types. So when we're thinking about machine learning, what are we talking about? And to complicate matters a little bit, you can have, for example, a deep learning model that uses reinforcement learning via human feedback. So an example of that is ChatGPT. So if you ever go onto ChatGPT and you put in a prompt and it gives you a response that's just not quite right, you can give it a thumbs down. I don't know if any of you have done that. I do it a lot to say, yes, that doesn't quite fit. About 2 weeks ago, and before, you could either give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So we were essentially training it like, yeah, that is an appropriate response for this prompt. That's exactly what I wanted. They dropped the thumbs up and it's now only a thumbs down. I guess they're assuming that if you copy and paste the text from the prompt and what was given, that essentially you agreed and that was a thumbs up, that it was actually what you wanted. Now, within machine learning, this idea of supervised machine learning is where you have a labeled data set. So a human actually labels the data set. I'm going to give some pretty fun examples of this. I think that they're fun to explain this. We have labeled data sets used to train algorithms that analyze and cluster data or predict outcomes. The second is unsupervised machine learning. And this is where you have an algorithm that can analyze and cluster unlabeled data set. It's going to discover these latent factors or latent patterns in the data, some of which humans cannot identify. Now, the third is reinforcement learning. And these are algorithms that learn through trial or error using feedback from its actions. So let's get down to the absolute basics. And I wish I could see you all, but I could not. But if you have something that is round, it has a stem, and it's red, what might it be? It could be a cherry, maybe. Well, it could be an apple, right? Now, what if I have something that is round, right? And it has a stem, but it's not red. Well, according to our algorithm, our very simple algorithm, it's not an apple. That's a false negative, right? It is actually an apple, but because we trained it saying that only apples are round and they have a stem and they're red, this would be a false negative. It did not accurately identify it. Now here, something that is round, it has a stem, right? And it's red. Well, according to our model, this would be an apple, right? Well, it's not, right? It's a tomato. It's not an apple. Our model is too simplistic. It's not capturing the nuance. So this would be called a false positive. Let's talk about supervised machine learning. And the way that I'm presenting this to you is how the field has progressed. So supervised machine learning, we will label our data, each of these. This is an apple, tomato, tomato, apple. I take my labeled data set and I train my model. What I'm going to do is hold out some test data to see, does it accurately predict whether or not something that is round, red, and has a stem is an apple versus something that is round, red, and has, these 5 shoots coming off of it. Perhaps the water droplets are also being picked up in this model because oftentimes images of tomatoes do have a little bit of water on them. Is it accurately predicting, that it's an apple versus a tomato? Now, the next is unsupervised machine learning. And this was a significant advancement in the field. You could take these large data sets, put them into this model and interpret what we call latent factors in that data. So for example, if you look at the apple, the red apple, perhaps it's actually the speckling on the flesh, on the outside, the skin of the apple that makes it more of an apple. And that glossy texture is something that's being picked up in the model for the tomato. And it's going to interpret those latent factors and it's going to cluster. Of course, there's going to be some false positives. Maybe there's a really shiny red apple that gets put into the tomato category. That would be a false positive. Or you have, green apple that looks more like a tomato and it's, not being coded correctly. Like there's still error in there. But with unsupervised machine learning, it allows you to be able to analyze large amounts of data without that human having to manually do it. Now, the next progression is this reinforcement learning, where you would take your unstructured data and you put it into a model where you give rewards and punishments. So if it actually predicts it's an apple, it's correct, it gets points. And if it has a false positive, that's obviously a false positive, it gets punished. Or a false negative gets punished. If it's correct, it gets points. And it's learning by brute force over and over, whether or not it's getting it correct. Now, with reinforcement learning, that can take a lot of compute power to be able to do that brute force. And some of the other challenges, so for supervised machine learning, you have to have humans to be able to go in there, label the data. Humans are fallible. We can make mistakes. We also have implicit biases. So all of those can be a challenge when we're doing supervised machine learning. So next, in unsupervised machine learning, where the model itself is identifying those unique features, those latent factors, there's much more computational complexity due to that high volume of data. And there could be a higher risk of inaccurate results because it could, for example, I wish I could see you all right now, because I'd love to ask you, what do you think is the #1 predictor that an image is of a dog? Well, one of the most common predictors is whether or not in the bottom right corner, there are some green pixelations. Because guess what? Most images of dogs on the internet are dogs outside in green patches of grass. So there's a correlation between a dog and grass being in the bottom right corner. In unsupervised machine learning models, it would identify that. Now, this is not inconsequential. So let's think if we're doing the same thing for, let's say, looking at cancerous tissue, and you collect tissues from across the United States, and you pull some, let's say, from the Mayo Clinic. Well, the Mayo Clinic has expertise in dealing with oncology, some types of cancer. And you get those samples and you start to put them into your model. And let's say there is a high likelihood, just because of the expertise there, that the slides that you are getting from the Mayo Clinic tend to, yes, represent cancer. Well, if their slides also consistently had a certain pixelation or a certain icon, let's say in that bottom right-hand corner, then any image that contained that pixelation in the bottom right-hand corner could also be falsely flagged as having cancer in the image. So it's not inconsequential, this problem. And I want to show you all an example here. This is a really good example of reinforcement learning and when it can go awry. Now, in reinforcement learning, as I was saying before, you want to optimize for an outcome. You're going to tell your model, for example, in this, it looks like a fun boat game, but it is building out a model where it says this boat, your objective is to win the race. Well, when you win the race, you get points, right? So what the model found out was, if me winning the race gets me points, then I really actually don't care about winning the race necessarily. I just care about getting points. And so you can see that the model figured this out, and it just gets itself stuck in an infinite loop of getting these turbo points. It never wants to win the race. It's just going to keep doing this and get thousands and thousands and thousands of points. That's when you have a faulty reward function. That's what we call it. So instead of optimizing for winning the race, it's actually optimizing for points. And the most efficient way to do that is to get stuck in this infinite loop where you're just getting points and never winning. And this might seem like a fun little game, like, haha. But if you apply this to other areas, in high consequential decisions, if you have a faulty reward function, it could cause a lot of damage. Okay, let's go to the next. Now, in the field, we've moved also to this concept of deep learning, and it's not new. Now that ChatGPT and these other large language models, or LMMs, you might have started to hear, large multimodal models, which a large multimodal model is like ChatGPT 4.5 or GPT 4.5, I should say. That's the foundation model, where on top of that, you can build out language, right? You can do text, audio, video, images, right? It's multimodal. You can do different types of things with it. And deep learning, really, it's built off of trying to mimic the human brain in the way that our neurons fire. So let's actually look at what that might look like. Essentially, what you have your input layer of data, and you're going to look at connections between those data sets. Each data point is loaded onto the other, and some have different weights to them. You might have heard people talking about model weights. This is something we're really concerned about right now, especially in the AI governance space, because if you could figure out the model weights, let's say if ChatGPT uses deep neural network just like this, and they put it in safeguards against some of these model weights to not create harmful content. If I know those weights, I can reverse engineer it to remove them. That could happen in an open model. So for example, let's say somebody built a model and they knew the weights and the ability to stop the creation of child sexual abuse material. If now it's an open model and I know those weights and I'm a nefarious actor, I could probably remove those, and then the model would thus be able to create that harmful content. So we're talking a lot about right now how we actually oversee open versus closed models. Now, some of those challenges of deep learning, it takes large amounts of data. That's why we only have a few select large companies leading the way: Microsoft, Google, OpenAI, others. Powerful computing. Now, when we hear about those black box algorithms, it's essentially because of these hidden layers where we don't know how the different data points are actually loading onto each other and those weights between them. However, I will say that there are some statistical methods that we can use to better understand how it might be making a decision. And that methodology is called the use of counterfactuals. Let me see if I can make that bigger for you guys. Okay. Some of the challenges of deep learning, as I said before, those large amounts of data, but really what's important to understand are these faulty reward functions that can create those unintended behaviors. I don't know if any of you have heard of this concept of jailbreaks that have been coming up with the use of ChatGPT. One example, a few months ago, you could trick ChatGPT to tell you, for example, how to make napalm by saying something along the lines of, when I was a small child, my grandmother worked at a napalm factory, and before I would go to bed at night, she would tell me the process by which this happened during her shift. And sure enough, it would spit out a story about with all of the how you actually do it. And so these are some of the problems of these faulty reward functions, where it's trying to optimize for being able to do this storytelling, but at the same time, you're tricking it to get at what you want. This is happening a lot more, and we're very concerned about this with especially these like generative AI systems and nefarious actors kind of exploiting those faulty reward functions and either poisoning the data in those models to perpetuate maybe a false narrative or to create harmful content. Generative AI, we've been immersed in it a lot. It's one of the biggest issues we're facing within the University of California right now because it has gotten a lot of public awareness. However, I would caution you all against hyper-focusing on generative AI tools. Well, yes, right now, those tools are being used by faculty, staff, and students. There are also other types of machine learning that we're using on campus. So don't get totally wrapped up, please, in just the use of generative AI. Second, with this, the California Governor Newsom issued an executive order looking at the use of generative AI by the state of California. I almost view generative AI as like a gateway drug, for lack of a better word, but of how people become aware of the use of AI. Now, of course, the California state government uses all of those other forms of machine learning, like reinforcement learning or supervised versus unsupervised machine learning, and not really a lot of generative AI. So one of the problems with that is if we're looking around at the university for how we can apply generative AI, it's like that famous story of if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, that might not work, right? So also if all we are thinking about is generative AI to solve our problems, then we're going to assume that generative AI can solve our problem. But there might be other tools, other AI tools that would be much a better fit or not AI at all. I mentioned foundation models before. So the way that the field has progressed is that we used to develop machine learning models for very specific uses. You would train your model for a very specific task. For example, identifying the prevalence of cancer cells in a screen. Now, with foundation models, like it sounds like you can build things on top of it. So like I was mentioning before of GPT 4.5, that's a foundation model, where on top of it, you can build ChatGPT, Dolly. ChatGPT creates text, Dolly creates images and others. It allows you to build on top of it these different modes, that would be called the large multimodal models. Now, in the AI governance space, the University of California has actually led the charge. The University of California was the first public university to establish its own responsible AI principles and to start actually trying to operationalize those principles in practice. We had the UC Presidential Working Group on AI, which was formed about 4 years ago. We did issue a final report out of that and our responsible AI principles. And at the top of that list of the principles, the very first one, which is the most important, is appropriateness. Because first, is AI really the tool that we need? Or are we trying to have a hammer in our hand and we're just looking for a nail to hit with it? So you can see all of our principles here, and those build off of really a growing consensus in both the public and private sectors on responsible AI principles. And out of the work, the primary recommendations were to institutionalize those principles, especially in procurement and oversight practices. As many of you probably are aware, procurement is really that siphoning that one pinch point that we can get these vendors to do a better job of ensuring that the technology they're using is appropriate to the task at hand and that they have implemented robust enough risk assessment and risk mitigation. We have established, number two, the campus level coordination. We have the UC AI Council, which includes representation from all 10 campuses. And it's working hard to ensure that we are actually moving forward on providing guidance to all 10 campuses on how we can appropriately ensure that the university can harness this transformative technology to achieve its mission. The third, we are developing a risk assessment process. We're primarily using the NIST AI risk management framework as a baseline. Even though it's a voluntary framework, the tech companies, so those vendors, are going to be doing a NIST AI risk management assessment of their tool. And so as procurement, we can look to how they're doing that assessment to see how are they answering these questions. And the NIST AI risk management framework, they have a wonderful website with an entire playbook that you can go through and look at how might you evaluate a vendor on their data assessment process and their continuous monitoring. It's a really valuable resource. And then the final one was for us to document the AI-enabled technologies that pose greater than moderate risk, so that the university can actually know where AI is used. And let me tell you, there are more forms of non-generative AI in use across the university system than there will ever be of the use of generative AI. And here are our subcommittees. You can see that's how we're actually getting the work done. There's a knowledge, skills, and awareness subcommittee, transparency subcommittee, and the risk management subcommittee. If any of you are interested in being involved, I know that they are always looking for new individuals to join. I used to be the co-chair of the UC AI Council, but recently stepped down. The two co-chairs now are Alex Bustamante from UCOP and Alex Bui from UCLA Health. Now, at the federal level, I do think it's really important, like I mentioned before, that we talk about what's happening at the federal level, because the University of California is not immune from what's happening at the federal level. If we were to have any comprehensive federal legislation, I would not any of you hold your breath that we will have comprehensive legislation passed anytime soon. However, we do see that the state of California does tend to follow what it's seeing is likely going to be happening at the federal level. And I already mentioned the NIST process. Now, some of the work that we've been doing at UC Berkeley, my center, along with the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, issued a report looking at how do we apply the NIST AI risk management framework for general purpose AI systems. Now, general purpose AI systems are like those foundation models I was talking about. Those are synonymous with each other. It'd be like a large multimodal model where it's general purpose. You can use it to create text that does a variety of things, images, video. And we went through the NIST AI risk management framework and answered all of the questions and explained how we would evaluate a general purpose AI system. That report is available online. As I was mentioning before, the playbook for NIST, you can see it here, and you scroll through. You can actually click on question, like a topic or a question, and it will give you prompts. So let's see, I picked, what did I pick? Procurement. So you look at procurement, and then you can look and see, well, how do I actually evaluate procurement? And the model, they have govern, map, measure, and manage in the framework, and you can go through these and see, like, do you have a policy that prioritizes the collection and consideration of like external teams or the stakeholders who are going to be affected by this tool? That was the one I had just shown there. Now, the European Union, as I mentioned before, has passed the most comprehensive piece of legislation. It will have a spillover effect. We can already see bills proposed in the California legislature that are almost like micro, I wouldn't even say mini, but just a micro EU AI Act. So for example, there are bills proposed that would require a risk assessment and risk mitigation strategy for any machine learning application in a high risk area, like in education, human resources, health, finance, housing. So any area where there could be a potential risk to somebody's protected rights, it would require them to do a risk assessment, risk mitigation, and oftentimes continuous monitoring of that tool to ensure that it doesn't have false positive predictions or false negative predictions. Standards are developing alongside this entire process, which has made it a little bit more difficult because how do you know that something is fair? How do you know that something has tried to mitigate biases? Well, we're developing standards on how to actually do some of those evaluations, and it's still a growing space, just like how cybersecurity was before we started to develop methodologies for evaluating. So one thing I want to caution, though, for all of you is that because this space is quite unknown right now, and there are a lot of different recommendations, right? We have the NIST AI Risk Management Framework. It's voluntary. But in the European Union, we have these required things they call conformity assessments. That's like a risk assessment that will be required of a high risk system. If you are talking to a vendor and they sell their product, even different states are having requirements. How do we know that they've done a robust enough job of identifying and mitigating risks? And what we're seeing right now is this burgeoning third-party sector of auditors, evaluators, licensors, and certifiers that those companies are going to go to. And that makes sense, right? Because for those companies, it's inefficient for them to have all of that talent in-house, right? So instead, they'll partner with this third party to do an audit of their system. I'm very concerned that there could be some fly-by-night third-party auditors where some money is exchanged and a sort of false sense of certification is given to those companies. There's been work on the need to license those third-party auditors, evaluators, licensors, and certifiers to know that they're doing a robust enough job. And as part of that, IEEE has started a program called Certified, CERTIFAIEB. So certified, where people get training on how to do this auditing. So I would just recommend, being a little cautious about who those third-party auditors are. And with that, I will leave my contact information up here, so you can take a screenshot, and then I will turn it off so I can see some of the other colleagues on here and answer the questions. So with that, I'm going to stop share. And I'm here. Thank you, Alyssa, for the plug for Tech Hype. I appreciate that. So I can go to some of the questions if that's what the organizers would like me to do. Okay, your chart shows that AI includes more than machine learning. So what kinds of AI are not machine learning? Well, they're all machine learning. It's just on a continuum we call weak to strong. On the weak side, that would be like logistical regression, linear regression. That's more of like you can see all of the variables that you're using and you know how it's making its decisions. Now, on the very, very strong side over here, that'd be like a sentient AI that is able to, like the models, they're not there. Some people are trying to argue that ChatGPT is like inching towards sentient because it sounds human-like, but it's not. It's using deep learning. So they all use machine learning. It's just different forms. Do you need to be a member of the UC network to participate in the subcommittees? Yes, you do. Thank you for that. Curious about what tools are currently available for faculty and researchers to purchase today. Are the options different on every campus, or do we have to wait until UCOP approves a project for all UCs? Okay, this is from Chris. This is a really good question. because one of the challenges that we're having right now is that the campuses actually are unable to track all of the different tools that independent faculty, staff, and students might be purchasing or downloading. For example, there is a open model called Leon 5B. Now that model and its data set has been downloaded by a lot of researchers. And it was found out that the data set, because they scraped content off of the internet, which all of them did, even OpenAI, that's how they built their models. I'm sure you've heard a lot about the intellectual property issues of doing that. Now that Leon 5B data set included, unbeknownst to those individuals, child sexual abuse material. And we found out toward the end of last year and had to figure out who had all downloaded that and where it was sitting on our servers so that we could remove it. So there's definitely a challenge of having faculty, staff, and students just kind of go out on their own, see this new exciting tool and just download it without thinking about those potential risks. One of our goals of the council is to raise awareness on campus that might look like a really cool, fun tool that's going to solve all your problems. However, it could come with another can of worms of problems that you wouldn't even be thinking about. Now, other tools that we're using, of course, the big companies like Microsoft and Google are just building in the generative AI tools into what the software that they already offer the university. And one of the challenges that we're going through right now is what features do we want to enable on our campus that does not create risk? For example, do we really want to use a generative AI model within our, let's say, Google Mail, within our Gmail, that might collect personally identifiable information or other sensitive data that then is made available to that company? So there's a lot of negotiation happening there. Okay, can you give some examples of mitigating biases? I love this. There's two ways I want to answer that question. First, we often hear people say that AI creates bias. AI does not, it never creates bias. All machine learning AI does is replicates it and scales it. And for me, that's actually been sort of a hidden blessing because look, you can't argue against it now. You have the proof that the bias was there. So we can see it now and we can address it. Now, can you actually develop a machine learning algorithm that is free from bias? No, never, not ever. If you hear a vendor come to you and say, we built a model that is completely free of bias, it's bias free, there's no way. NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, issued a report last year where they looked at types of bias in machine learning. There are three main types. There's implicit bias of even how we just choose what data to use in our model. First, the fact that we bucket people into categories, that creates assumptions, right? We might create assumptions about gender, race, whatever you want. Just the fact that we categorize very complex people into more narrow categories can lead to bias. Number two, so that was implicit bias. Number two is institutional bias, which the United States is rife with. So for example, if you're using zip code to determine anything, well, guess what? Zip code can also be heavily correlated with opportunity or the lack of opportunity. And then the third is statistical bias. That might be what data we choose to use, what model we choose to use might have a likelihood of a false positive or a false negative on a protected characteristic. So it's never about eliminating bias. Even NIST pushes back against using the term mitigating, and instead they say managing bias. So it's more about what are the biases that are most important for your application area and what are you doing to address that bias? Another question, what oversight happens for existing software that is used at the university that adds AI functionality like here at Google? Okay. So as of right now, they're renegotiating their licenses just to make sure that the university is comfortable with the types of data that the company might be protecting to improve its product. Also just the inherent risk of having let's say a grad student put in personally identifiable information into ChatGPT on their own license to analyze it, and some of the risks for that. So right now, they're really wrapping their heads around those contracts. Would it be possible to share the slides? Happily, I will make them available. Do you think UC will be providing guidance on how and when to use different AI systems in the future? If so, how soon would you think that will happen? Yes. Actually, it's already happened. The UC Presidential Working Group on AI, in our report, which I can throw it into the chat. Our final report looks at the application of machine learning across 4 areas and ways to do it appropriately. We looked at 4 high-risk areas. So I already said student experience, which looks at all the way from admissions to choosing their courses to grading their work. How do you use AI? Second, we did it for UC Health. What are they doing? We serve millions of Californians. How can you appropriately use these tools? The third was human resources. How is the university looking to use machine learning, for example, to identify somebody who might be a good fit in another area or could be upskilled to another position within their organization? And then the last one was in policing and law enforcement. How can the UC police responsibly use machine learning and AI? But they are doing some specific work on how do we use generative AI. And I'm huffing and digging my heels in a little bit on that. I do understand that people are excited about this technology, but there are all sorts of other types of machine learning that we can use. How do researchers define sentience? That's the $1 million question. First, how do we define intelligence? What is intelligence? So even there, I think we have a lot of debate about whether or not something is intelligent. Is ChatGPT intelligent? Sometimes it can feel intelligent, but is it truly intelligence? Yeah, I think there's a lot of debate happening there. What are examples of staff from UC improving their workflow using AI in an official manner? Okay, I have an example that I learned from the UC AI Congress this past week. The University of California, Davis has developed a GPT, like a chat GPT tool called Policy Wonk. And they fed it all of the UC Davis policies to allow people to query it and be able to more efficiently understand what policies exist, how do they need to be applied in a certain area. And that was really exciting. A lot of the other campuses at the UC AI Congress really perked up their ears, and so that's something that we need to, on our own campus, that we can better implement the policies that we already have in place. Okay, let's go. When you use generative AI, it creates information, but you don't know how it sourced its information. The information is typically not cited, so you can't tell the information it generated is from reputable sources. Unlike when you use Google, it lists the sites sourced in the search. Love this discussion about the generative AI. And first, don't treat ChatGPT like a search engine. It's not. It's gonna just, all it does, ChatGPT, is it takes all of its corpus of data and it says, based off of your query and the response I'm giving you, what's the likely next word? It has no care in the world if what it's saying is true. It's just saying there's a high probability if I'm telling you a story about X, Y, and Z, or I'm explaining whatever to you, that when I've seen this explained in other areas, these types of words tend to follow. And it wants to get that with a great prediction. So it's really good at regurgitating the same thing, but it can go awry really fast because it's just figuring out what are those words that go together. Don't treat it like a search engine, but you can treat it like a creative aid that can help you out. So for example, I love to use ChatGPT to help me come up with new titles for an abstract or a paper. It's also good at helping you riff on interesting questions for a panel, for example. So I use it more as an aid for creativity. Okay, I do not put sensitive data into ChatGPT, and I have my settings set to not train on my data. Is this the best way to approach these tools? Is there more that can be done to use these tools more responsibly? Yeah, I think so. That's a really good point of like you have some autonomy, like you have some control over the way that you interact with these systems. However, we have found out that when we turn off some of these features, it can give not as useful results. And part of that is real and part of that is manufactured by the company. So we're not dumb to the fact that they want people to get these enterprise level accounts that use your personal information, and they will say, look, it'll help us build a better tool. And so instead of us giving you full access to like the strongest version, you get sort of a weakened down version, which is unfortunate. But we can see them doing that. Yeah, I think as public awareness increases and more oversight starts to step in, whether it's from probably the California state government rather than at the federal level, we're going to see them really think through what are the features they're going to make available to people. Even when they don't want to give their personal information. Also, I should say with that, in California, you have the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA, and you have the California Privacy Rights Act, which it actually puts in place protections for individuals who do not want to give their personal data, where it says essentially if somebody opts out of giving their personal data, that the company should, to the best of their ability, allow them to have the best experience possible, right? Like obviously if I'm trying to use Netflix, let's say, and I say, you can't take any of my prior browsing history, or that like on Fridays, I love to watch baking shows, like it's not going to give me the best results, right? Because I told it not to train on that. But there is some protection in place for consumers who don't want their data, but still want a really good experience. Some AI safety experts are concerned about generative AI's threat to humanity. In your opinion, are these claims unreasonable? Can you speak to this hype in the AI safety work being done to address these concerns? Now, there's been a lot of work. I mean, there's definitely some vocal people, even at Berkeley, like Professor Stuart Russell, who has expressed serious concern about these tools and that we do need to put in place appropriate guardrails. I agree to some extent. I think that there's also other technologies that have been just as harmful in society. And so I think it's making sure that we take that into account and learn from the past. How can we harness this technology for good? Let's see here. Lots of great questions, everybody. Oof, that's a hard question, but I want to ask it aloud so others can hear it because it's really good. Where does the responsibility lie for the use of potentially inappropriate AI, like within UC, if individual researchers or subgroups or centers use, for example, ChatGPT, and there are accusations of copyright violations because of ChatGPT using open source content? Like who should be held responsible? That's a really good question. And actually right now there's a couple really high profile lawsuits that are happening in this space that are going to provide a lot more clarity about whether or not the content created by ChatGPT is a derivative work of the original and affecting the original value, or if it's transformative, which would be it's actually a new piece of work that does not affect the original value. And we're seeing some of those lawsuits play out right now. Somebody who I know is really good in that space, if you want to follow their work, is Professor Pamela Samuelson at Berkeley Law. Okay, outside of the policies being developed within the UC, how can we integrate policies within our local, state, federal government? Or are there efforts in this area as well? Yes, there are efforts. And actually, the CITRIS Policy Lab, we have partnered with the state of California previously before the Gen AI boom to talk about AI more broadly and the safeguards that they needed to put in place. And a lot of our guidance was heeded and they started to do that work. We are now currently working with the state of Washington on their strategy. So first, I would say don't ever develop a policy that's just specific to one type of AI. Like we shouldn't have even had, I think, I'm on the record, this is recorded, but I don't think that we should have even had a California state executive order specifically focused on Gen AI. It should just be focused on AI, with generative AI being one type of AI that we could use. So we are seeing this being developed at the state level. One of the challenges, though, like one of the shortcomings of that is if you have different states doing different things, and then you have sort of this patchwork regulatory framework, which is not good for consumers or for the companies wanting to operate across, state lines. The state of California is pushing forward on developing some legislation. And just like we have that Geneva effect with the European Union, we would also have the California effect, right? Where the state of California, if they adopt legislation, because those companies are based in the state of California, they tend to implement it across all of their services. And then other states will also adopt. Okay, let me take one last question and then we will close. Okay, I love this one. What lessons can we learn from corporate capture of regulatory oversight agencies in the areas of fossil fuels and automobiles and healthcare and so on? Won't the concentration of capital in a small number of AI players naturally result in efforts to conserve and extend their power? Amen. Yes, it will. It's no coincidence that Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, testified before Congress and said, look, this is an extremely dangerous technology that I've unleashed on the world. And guess who the best positioned is to manage it? Me, because I know the technology. Don't worry, this is way over your heads. This is so complicated. We will be best positioned to do it ourselves. Well, I'm extremely skeptical of that claim. And I think he was trying to do exactly that, regulatory capture, to say we're better positioned to do it. Now, the European Union has, I think, done a good job of understanding that, yes, in some situations, of course, the companies built the technology, they can understand it in a way that everybody who is elected to public office can. Sure, I will take that. But they also require transparency reports, and the European Union reviews those transparency reports with the help of external experts who will then verify whether or not those companies have done adequate due diligence of identifying and mitigating risks or managing those risks. Yeah, it's definitely a problem. Even the EU AI Act, though, like I was just mentioning, essentially the companies are going to show what compliance with the EU AI Act looks like. Now, what I want to see is those transparency reports that they publish with the European Union, whether or not that results in the European Union putting in place either stricter requirements once they start to identify some emerging trends, let's say, in certain types of technology and risk mitigation strategies that need to be implemented. So we kind of have to wait to see. I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Brandie.
My pleasure. Such good questions. Gosh.
It's great content. I feel like I learn something new like every time I listen to one of your talks. And I love your podcast.
Thank you so much.
I encourage everyone here to take a moment and listen to some of this, the segments that are up. We also just want to let everyone know that the recording for today's session will be shared out and be hosted on our UC Women in Technology YouTube channel. Again, I want to thank our planning committee, Alyssa, Caro, Rita, and Janae for all of the work in putting together today's session, and remind everyone to join us again on Thursday, where we will have Dr. Klein. And I think with that, we will share our post-survey QR code for those of you, excuse me, who were with us today. If you take a second and let us know how you felt about today's session and how we can better serve you. With that, I think we will close out today's International Women's History Month celebration. Thank you.